So our next speaker is going to be a remote presentation. Mike Thomas from the North Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board in Santa Rosa. And hopefully Mike will be coming up here on the Zoom. And he's going to be talking about a tiered monitoring for benthic cyanobacteria and cyanotoxin in Northern California rivers. So Mike, if you're there and you can hear us, start talking, I guess.
Yep. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. I'm going to share. Can you see my slide?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, yeah, thanks for the introduction. Again, my name is Mike Thomas. I am the FHAB coordinator for the North Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board. I work pretty closely with Rich Fadness, who's our swamp or surface water coordinator. And today I'm going to talk to you about tiered monitoring for benthic cyanobacteria and their cyanotoxins in rivers. Oops, let me move this a little bit. So I know you all are familiar, but it doesn't hurt to quickly go over. When we're discussing HABs or harmful algal blooms, we need to keep in mind that there are two general types of blooms, planktonic and benthic. So planktonic HABs are your floating cyanobacteria that grow suspended and dispersed in the water column. Planktonic blooms are generally associated with lakes and reservoirs. However, some planktonic blooms can form in rivers, or river blooms can be seeded from upstream, like we have historically seen in the Klamath Basin. Benthic blooms are your cyanobacteria that grow attached to bottom substrates. Then they detach, float as mats, and accumulate in recreational areas. Benthic cyanobacteria are commonly associated with rivers and streams, but can also occur in lakes and reservoirs. And with the removal of the dams at Kopko and Iron Gate, we now have less planktonic HABs in the Klamath Basin. So a lot of our focus is now shifting towards benthic blooms. So the public health risks associated with benthic cyanobacteria and their cyanotoxins follow a slightly different exposure route. Unlike planktonic blooms, the bulk of the cyanotoxin load is contained within the mat material rather than the surrounding water. So instantaneous grabs of ambient water cannot characterize the benthic bloom. Over time, mats like the one shown here will detach either through disturbance or natural senescence. Once detached, mats will float on the water surface to downstream areas. A particular concern is when mats accumulate and become stranded, especially at areas that are frequented by people and pets. Rich has coined this process as increased deliverability. So the primary exposure route for benthic cyanobacteria is the incidental ingestion of mat material, and due to their water recreating behavior, pets and children are most at risk. So in response to several dog deaths in Northern California rivers, the North Coast Water Board conducted an extensive study from 2016 to 2019 in the Eel, South Fork Eel, and Russian rivers. This study documented benthic cyanobacteria and the cyanotoxins of concern, evaluated different sampling and analytical techniques, and ultimately provided monitoring recommendations for a successful benthic HAB monitoring program. And in the resources shown at the bottom of the slide here, you can find a link to our 2022 report, as well as a recording for a presentation that was given to the California Cyanobacteria Harmful Algal Bloom, or CCHAB network. So the monitoring recommendations for benthic cyanobacteria, which I'll cover in the next slide, utilize solid phase absorption toxin tracking, or SPAT samplers. SPATs are essentially a mesh bag filled with a known amount of absorptive resin that is deployed using an embroidery hoop. SPATs are very handy in that they are sensitive enough to capture and accumulate very low concentrations of dissolved toxins that are leaked from benthic mats. Over time, these samplers can characterize benthic cyanobacteria that are growing upstream. SPATs are easy to deploy and relatively low cost when compared to repeated benthic mat sampling. It's important to note that they are not applicable to recommended trigger levels because they do not measure toxin concentrations per unit volume. In another 2022 report, the regional board recommends a 4 to 8 day deployment to characterize upstream conditions and to target anatoxins using HP20 resin. Okay, so the benthic monitoring recommendations that came out of our efforts follow a tiered approach. So first, you will use SPATs as sentinel samplers to determine when cyanotoxins are increasing in the river system. Once SPATs indicate that cyanotoxins are increasing, you would then implement visual monitoring to document the location, extent, and condition of benthic toxic mats. And third, if mats are abundant, detaching, and accumulating, or their deliverability is increasing, you would then conduct mat sampling to confirm that the bloom is in fact toxic. So our benthic report identifies 3 mat-forming genera that pose the greatest health risks in Northern California rivers. These are Anabina, Microcoleus, formerly known as Formidium, and Oscillatoria, which I remember by the acronym AMO. We have also identified anatoxins as the primary cyanotoxin class of concern in Northern California due to its prevalence, its high measured concentrations, and its notoriety as the very fast death factor. So in 2022 and 2023, the regional board conducted a series of special studies to evaluate and implement the tiered monitoring recommendations. To do so, data sets included concurrent monitoring of all 3 tiers. So that's collecting SPATs, visual assessments, and benthic mat samples at the same time. And then we actually also implemented the recommendations at other sites such that the successive tiers are triggered. As shown on the map to the right, study sites were located in the mainstem Eel, South Fork Eel, Navarro, and Russian rivers. Sites were monitored weekly to capture baseline conditions starting in May, then through peak bloom season and into the start of senescence in October. Note that results from our special studies were provided to the CCHAB Network's benthic subcommittee as they review and revise benthic guidelines for the state. So while conducting the special studies, which I'll go over the data here shortly, the regional board utilized current benthic guidance as well as interim thresholds. With the exception of the North Coast region in 2023, current benthic guidance applies statewide, and there are currently no numeric trigger levels associated with this guidance. So it's not to be confused with your planktonic trigger levels that we're all used to. Rather, toxic algae alerts for benthic cyanobacteria are recommended based on any cyanobacteria presence or any cyanotoxin detections, which, as you can imagine, can result in lots of postings because cyanobacteria and cyanotoxins are almost always present in low levels. To more accurately identify health risks, the regional board developed interim thresholds for the 2023 portion of their studies based on best professional judgment and historical data. These include the SPAT and percent cover components shown there at the bottom of the slide. It's important to note that these numbers are not based on any human health risk assessments or health endpoints. Okay, so I'm going to go into some of our data from the special studies. First, we're going to be looking at concurrent monitoring. So this is when we're collecting data for all 3 tiers at the same time. So here we have the results for the South Fork Eel River in 2022. Graphs will follow the same format on each of these slides unless stated otherwise. So you're going to have your time on the horizontal axis. Then on your left vertical axis, you're going to have cyanotoxin concentrations in spats and benthic mats. And then on your right vertical axis, you're going to have cyanobacteria percent cover. So spat measurements are shown in the solid line and closed circle, benthic mats in that dashed line and open circle, and then cyanobacteria percent cover is the dotted line. So remember, we are focusing on anatoxins since these have been identified as the cyanotoxin class of concern. We did collect microcystins data, but it's not shown here as this has not been identified as a benthic cyanotoxin of concern. What you see at these two sites is the initial increase in spat anatoxins, which starts to occur about 1 to 2 weeks prior to increases in benthic mat toxicity. We see that both of these increases in anatoxins in mats and spats occur prior to increases in cyanobacteria, percent cover. Sorry. Because we are operating under the current guidance in 2022, a toxic algae alert was recommended in early July. Once small amounts of cyanobacteria were observed in the river. Under the tiered approach, a posting recommendation would have been recommended in early August once that 100 nanogram per gram threshold in spats was reached, indicating that mat toxicity and percent cover were increasing. So still in the South Fork Eel River, however, now we are in 2023, where we are using the interim guidance. Looking at anatoxins, we again see an increase in concentrations in spats, as well as benthic mats, prior to increases in that cyanobacteria percent cover. However, in this scenario, we were receiving spat and mat results on about a 2-week delay. So the basis for our posting was the large increase in cyanobacteria percent cover in mid-August. At the time of the recommendation, we knew that anatoxins were starting to increase in the weeks prior, but we just did not know to what extent. So as illustrated here, timely results are necessary to effectively implement the tiered approach. The posting was recommended several months later than what would have occurred in late May if we were operating under the current guidance. Okay, moving to the Russian River in 2022, we see that spat concentrations remain low throughout the study. There were some small spikes in spats in the top graph. However, percent cover remained low at both sites. Because deliverability was low, no postings were recommended in this situation. However, because it was 2022 and we were operating under the current statewide guidance, the toxic algae alert was recommended at the start of the study due to low detections in spats, which did not necessarily indicate increased health risks at these locations. A similar pattern was observed in the Russian River in 2023. However, no postings were issued under the interim thresholds. Okay, now moving into the Navarro River in 2023, you can see that anatoxins oscillated throughout the season but remained low. Note that spat and mat results for this site were also coming in at about a two-week delay. So when we saw the large increase in percent cover in mid-August, we did recommend a toxic algae alert out of an abundance of caution. Later, we documented that cyanotoxins concentrations remain low despite this large increase in percent cover. So this scenario demonstrates the importance of visual assessments, especially if lab testing is not feasible for partners, but also the importance of collecting that toxin data to get the full picture of what's going on. Current guidance would have resulted in a posting at the beginning of the study when health risks were not present. Okay, so moving into implementation, this is, remember, when successive tiers are triggered, so we're not collecting them concurrently. We had 2 test sites in 2023 for implementing the tiered approach, one in the Russian River and one in the main stem Eel River. Note that for these graphs, we only have SPAT data, but for both anatoxins and microcystins nodularans. As you can see, there were no large increases in cyanotoxin concentrations, so visual assessments were not triggered, and no benthic mat samples were collected. For study purposes, we did conduct a visual assessment on the final sampling date and confirmed that there were no benthic blooms present. So based on the tiered approach, no postings were recommended for either of these test sites. If operating under the current guidance, like we keep seeing, a posting would have been recommended in late May due to low-level detections in SPATs. Okay, so now moving into the wrap-up and discussion. So to bring all of this together, your first step is to strategically deploy SPATs in your river network. We are currently researching how many SPATs this may take, but this would likely vary based on the river network and available funding. Once you start to see increases in anatoxins in your SPATs, the second step would be getting eyes out there to visually assess whether any benthic blooms are present. If you observe blooms and increased deliverability, then you would collect your benthic mat sample to confirm that the bloom is in fact toxic. Essentially, the SPAT is your kind of canary in the coal mine that lets you know when river conditions are changing. Again, the toxin load is in the benthic mats themselves, so instantaneous water grabs cannot characterize the benthic blooms. Okay, so quickly, just to compare costs, looking at different monitoring approaches. So we have traditional monitoring, which is collecting or doing repeated visual assessments and collecting your benthic mat samples. We have concurrent monitoring, which is kind of the researchy approach that I just discussed, where you're collecting all 3 tiers. And that's mainly to get a handle on what kind of relationships are in your system. And then you have the tiered approach, which we are recommending such that tiers are triggered. So under your traditional monitoring, oh, and sorry. So time and money is shown here on a scale of 1 to 3, with 3 being more time or money. So under traditional monitoring, there are no sentinel SPATs to indicate potential health risks upstream. So more time and cost is spent conducting visual assessments as well as collecting repeated benthic mat samples. With concurrent monitoring, there are costs with deploying SPATs. However, these help you zero in on whether benthic blooms are likely to be present, saving a little bit of time and cost on visual assessments, but it can still be pricey and time consuming to continually collect those benthic mat samples. By implementing the tiered approach, most of the cost is associated with SPATs, but these sentinel samplers save you time and money by letting you know when to conduct your visual assessment, and the toxicity of any identified benthic bloom only needs to be confirmed with a minimum of 1 benthic mat sample. However, it's important to note that backwater areas or isolated patches of mat-forming cyanobacteria will always be present, and even the most robust monitoring program cannot guarantee that the public will be fully protected at any given time and location. A tiered approach is expected to reduce exposure incidents by identifying major health risks in riverine systems. And overall, it is the most time and cost-effective option. So for benthic monitoring in the Klamath Basin, the Klamath River was previously dominated by highly toxic planktonic HABs, at least in California, in the Copco and Iron Gate reservoirs that were causing issues in the river downstream. To monitor health risks associated with these blooms, ambient water grabs were analyzed for microcystins. Now that these specific blooms are taken out of the equation with dam removal, more attention is shifting to benthic HABs in other parts of the basin. Benthic microcoleus blooms and anotoxins have been identified, for example, in the Scott River. And as we saw in this presentation, identifying and characterizing these blooms will require a different monitoring approach. With all these data and tools now available, the Regional Water Board would like to assist KBMP partners in establishing their own benthic monitoring program, hopefully by implementing the tiered approach. And just a quick note here to keep an eye out for our new reports regarding our special studies that will be coming out soon, as well as the revised benthic guidance that will be out hopefully in spring of next year. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions. I know I'm throwing a lot at you late in the day after a long day. So if you want to reach out to me just via email or give me a call, I'm also happy to talk to you then. So thank you.